Well, so thank you so much, Anthony, for your kind invitation. And I must say it's been such an inspiring afternoon, and really enjoyed, first of all, watching the pre-recorded videos, and also the really rich discussions that we've had so far this afternoon. And it's been a long session as well, so I hope everyone still feels energetic enough to follow my story. And it's also good to see that we've been joined by colleagues across the globe, and that in our practice we seem to have really embraced internationalization at home by so many different institutions. Even though we might be working at very different speeds, we may have very different opportunities and also some obstacles that we have to try and circumvent. But I think the future is a very bright one for internationalization at home. But I have been asked to present more of a critical reflection on today's discussion. And I would also like to, before I start, as Eva did at the start as well, to also really acknowledge that I'm part of a particular context. I work in the Netherlands at the Hague University of Applied Sciences, which means that most of our degree programs are taught in Dutch. And that's also proposes different challenges into how we want to internationalize teaching and learning. And so internationalization at home may be framed and maybe implemented in a slightly different manner as compared to those countries where English is the universal, the medium of instruction, and will have possibly very different rationales as well. So some of the things I might be saying will resonate with you. You see commonalities, and in other cases, you might have different drivers and different obstacles in your institutional context. So what I'd like to do in my closing keynote is to reflect on how can we move from this rich practice of internationalization at home initiatives towards a practice that is truly impactful, and what is really needed for that. How do we create that impact and that purpose that we envisage for internationalization at home? So what we've seen, and Eva already mentioned that as well in her address, is that in the COVID pandemic, obviously internationalization at home has gained more traction. It's really moved to the center stage of us discussing internationalization in our institutional strategies. But the question is, how intentional are we? Do we understand the same thing when we talk about internationalization at home? And there was a very interesting report, and I think this conference also contributed to that, which is a publication by the Universities UK International, which came out last June in 2021, with the title Internationalization at Home, Developing Global Citizens Without Travel. And as a subtitle, it said international activities at home, showcasing impactful programs, benefits, and good practices. And what we found in the report, and this is also something that we really observe across Europe, and I hope that Eva can support that as well, because we've had many discussions as part of our role in the steering group on internationalization at home at the EAI, is that we see indeed a lot of different activities. One that obviously is really quite prevalent at the moment are our COIL or virtual exchange practices. But the risk is that we're losing sight of the bigger picture of internationalization at home, and there might be a risk that COIL and virtual exchange are becoming synonymous with internationalization at home, whereas it's just one of the many tools that we can use. We also see, and again, this was also very clear in today's program as well, that there's a lot of focus on campus life and making international students feel at home. And we had really interesting discussions on whether we are very inclusive in that, and how do we engage all of our students, and what are some of the mechanisms that might marginalize some of our students, and for that reason they might opt out from the internationalization activities that we organize. We see a lot of activities in terms of co-curricular projects, so centrally organized institution-wide projects that students can participate in on a voluntary basis. So students that are self-selecting and opting for those kinds of projects is another activity that's quite prevalent. Whereas inside the formal curricula of study programs, we often see that internationalization at home is sort of taken care of. It's almost like ticking a box because there's one module that is dedicated to internationalization within that particular discipline or within the future field of work, or an intercultural skills, communication, or what have you module. A lot of the activities do hinge on the presence of international students. In a Dutch context, it's still very much a case of wanting to create international classrooms, whereas we also know of the fact that the great majority of students worldwide are not mobile. So if we're all looking at opportunities to create international classrooms, we have to question, where do all of these international students come from? Because we know that the majority is not mobile. And we see a lot of activities that relate to civic engagement projects. So community outreach programs, interacting with groups in the local communities, whereby students can also develop intercultural competence skills. So we see a great level of activity, but the question is it, on the one hand, is it fair to equate internationalization at home as a series of activities? Are we doing the concept any justice in that? And also, if so many of our efforts are part of the co-curricular space, extracurricular or informal curriculum, campus life, do we know how we assess and monitor? How do we know that that we indeed are successful? And so what is actually happening in terms of assessing our practices and seeing whether they actually really affect student development. And in that sense, we also need to ask ourselves, do we have any impact? As we noted in our previous discussions as well, most students who opt for the co-curricular projects, who are open to intercultural communication workshops, who are there participating in informal extracurricular activities, are often those students that might not need it necessarily. They're the ones that are already engaged, are already interested, very often already have a rich international experience, have traveled to multiple countries. And so how do we reach out to the masses of those students who are not engaging in that? And also, can we really claim it's impactful when some of the activities only last for 1 or 2 weeks, 6 weeks, and we know very little about how we have onboarded or prepared the students, but also what happens after this one international activity. Now, in the definition of internationalization at home by Jos Belen and Elspeth Jones, and this is the one that is sort of generally become accepted in the field of internationalization at home, we indeed see that it's maybe not fair to consider internationalization at home as an activities-based process, because indeed the definition says that it's about the purposeful integration of international and intercultural dimensions into the formal and informal curriculum for all students within domestic learning outcomes. So what this definition tells us is that internationalization at home is a process that is planned and leads to a certain outcome. So if we want to move beyond activities, which can be a very rich practice, but really look at how do we innovate our teaching and learning practices, then I would argue that for a robust and embedded internationalization at home practice, we need to start with the formal curriculum as the real driver for internationalization at home. It's not the only driver, mind you, but it is the one that will enable all of our students to partake in internationalization of learning. I often use the model by Betty Less that you see on this slide because she positions the knowledge in and across disciplines at the core of internationalization of the home curriculum. A curriculum that meets the requirements of professional practice and citizenship, that is assessed and that is systematically developed across the program for all students. So in that sense, we need to be looking at what it means to unpack the global and intercultural dimensions of the discipline. And by doing that, also maybe becoming acutely aware of what the local elements are of the discipline, the contents, the practice that we are exposing our students to. It also means that if we want to progress in internationalization at home, it also requires us to anchor the international and intercultural dimension in explicitly internationalized and interculturalized learning outcomes, both at modular level and at the graduate level as well, and really to build a continuum of internationalized learning outcomes as they present the building blocks of a course of studies. And mind you, I wrote down internationalized and interculturalized because it's my firm belief that within the discipline itself, there are many facets and aspects where we can see there might be different local practices and different international practices, different understandings, different paradigms and theories that we might want to delve into. So it's not necessarily about adding an international dimension, but about internationalizing and making it very international, very intentional as to what we're doing already. And it also requires that we use explicit assessment criteria so that it becomes very clear to our students what is it that they're developing through the modules, through the degree course, so that they can articulate once they've graduated to future employers, this is what I've actually developed. These are the international and intercultural skills and knowledge that I've gained throughout the course of my studies. And by embedding internationalization at home, first of all, in the formal curriculum, I think we can become more inclusive as we can reach the 100% of students. And if we don't do that, we run the risk of internationalization at home remaining a marginalized practice. This diagram was actually taken by the European European Consortium of Accreditation, who made this graph to show that we are looking for an alignment across the whole spectrum of teaching and learning. If we are not clear about what we intend to achieve with our internationalization practice, and if it's not laid down and articulated in intended learning outcomes, and not supported by how we teach and how we support student learning and assess that learning, then we'll never be able to demonstrate very clearly that we've achieved the outcomes that we intend to, that we aspire to with internationalization at home. If we are not clear about the intended goal of internationalization, we might be having, we may need to deal with confusion within our lecturers, within our students. If it's not clear what the intended learning outcomes are, it might be very ambiguous to students and to staff, what should students be really learning? And if the teaching practice and the learning practice are not in sync with that, and students may lack the necessary support and may end up feeling very frustrated or feeling very anxious. And finally, if we don't assess them, then obviously we don't know whether we're successful. And obviously our leadership would need to have some convincing arguments, compelling arguments to demonstrate that the resources that go into curriculum reform actually pay off and are effective. So alignment is critical within the formal curriculum, but also within the entire student experience. Because as I already said, I do think the formal curriculum is the main driver of internationalization at home, but it doesn't act in isolation. So we need to consider the entire student experience. Besides the formal curriculum, where with clearly internationalized and interculturalized learning outcomes that are planned and that are assessed, we need to think about how we deliver this experience, think of our educational vision, and see how we can utilize the diversity in our learners and of our staff and move towards inclusive learning and teaching pedagogies. We saw a great wealth of wonderful initiatives that are designed to have meaningful engagement and interaction for students across the campus, engaging domestic and international students and bringing the local communities as well. And I think there were great examples that you've all shared in the videos and in the discussions we've had today. And we see a lot of activity in that. And obviously, those of us working at central level often don't have any influence in the formal curriculum, but have quite a few opportunities within the student experience at campus. We should also acknowledge that there's an informal curriculum and goes by different names as well. On the one hand, we can think of the extracurricular, the co-curricular space, and create meaningful interactions on campus. But the informal curriculum is something that educators don't have direct influence over. By this, I mean the conversations that students will continue to have once they've left the lecture hall or indeed left the campus. And we'd like to foster that kind of interaction as well and show to students that it's important and that the learning also continues beyond the campus. And again, there's been a lot of good practice sharing in this as well. We need to think about the proper support for all of our students. How do we support them in their global learning, making sure that we're inclusive and that we're not excluding or marginalizing certain student groups. So focusing our attentions on the well-being and the full participation of our students. And this also requires, and this also came up fortunately in our discussions today, is that for that we need to have lecturers, we need to have academics that are equipped for this role, that feel comfortable in initiating dialogues with students and finding out where are our blind spots, are we truly inclusive, what kind of different perspectives are there, and are we accommodating those different perspectives as well. So progressing in internationalization at home, we need to make sure that all of these different elements are well balanced. And as I said, the curriculum is a good starting place because there we can show and demonstrate to our students that it's relevant, that it matters in relation to the content of the discipline that you're studying, and also in relation to the future job that you will have, but also to be that engaged citizen in the society, in the community where you're located. But we know it is difficult. We know that the curriculum is a contested space. And it can be a real challenge. And not all of us, as already said, have a direct role to play in the curriculum. Often it's not clear who owns the curriculum and what roles do we play, who owns which particular part, who sets the agenda, and more importantly, who decides what is included in the curriculum and which voices are we including, and are we aware of what voices we are excluding and for whatever reason. There are a lot of competing priorities. And so for academic programs and academics, it's very hard to balance and see, okay, so what do I have to focus on? There are many big themes out there. Internationalization of the home curriculum is one of them. Increasingly, decolonization of the curriculum or indigenization of the curriculum are also asking for the attention of academics, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion, contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals, while also digitizing education and making sure that we allow for lifelong learning and creating flexible learning paths. And this is not exhaustive. So investing in internationalization of the home curriculum is a challenging task, but maybe the answer is that we should not be looking at all of these different themes as competitors, as rivals, but we should be looking for connection and synergy and joint forces. And that leads me to hopefully a more positive outlook. If we are looking critically at what we're doing and really wanting to be serious about being more inclusive and innovative in internationalization at home, I think we need two things. Eva already touched on this as well. On the one hand, we need to opt for a multi-stakeholder approach and look at the different professional roles, teams, colleagues who are present in our institutions and discuss why should they be contributing to internationalization at home, how can they do that, and what could they contribute to this practice, which requires us to really deeply understand what different roles do we have, but also what perspectives do we have, and move towards a community of practice where we can co-create and innovate together. And I'll come back to that in a few moments as well. The second thing we need to do is to connect with other big themes, linking internationalization at home either to employability outcomes or society issues. This particular part has gained much more attention in internationalization in general. The internationalization definition by Hans de Wit and Jane Knight was recently updated to include the society aspect. And so now the definition has added the part that internationalization is a purposeful process to enrich the quality of education and research, but also to make a meaningful contribution to society. And there, I think we can find plenty of hooks within the rationales that are trending in our institutions. And we see indeed that internationalization at home is increasingly being linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. And we see more practice where civic engagement is really the outcome that we're looking for. So moving towards the close of my talk, I would like to leave you with some questions for reflection. And I've based this on a very interesting article that was recently published in January of this year by Darla Deerdorf, Hans de Wit, Betty Lesk, and Harvey Charles on the occasion of the new edition of the Handbook of Internationalization of Higher Education. Because we need to be aware that internationalization at home, if we want it to be a successful embedded practice, we need to engage more stakeholders and not just turn to the likely allies that we can identify. And also ask ourselves, within our institution, who is engaged in internationalization within and beyond? Who's being privileged and who's being left out? Because we might need teams of colleagues that were initially not on our radar, but can play a crucial role and become our ambassadors in furthering internationalization at home. In my case, in The Hague, and I know that it's similar for Eva in Amsterdam as well, it's been the educational advisors who often support our academic programs in redesigning and renewing, innovating curricula, but are often very much excluded from internationalization practice and often don't have the real know-how. And so joining forces with educational advisors, for me, has been incredibly helpful in my role. And I think that if we allow more voices in from different institutional stakeholders and stakeholders outside of the institution, we can move towards a richer and more informed practice with more divergent perspectives. We also need to see what systematic policy and operational changes need to be made. For example, what are the internationalization practices and policies? What are the power structures, the teaching methods, tuition policies, and other aspects? And become very mindful of the fact that internationalization at home is a concept, in theory is inclusive, because it clearly states we're aiming at all students. But we do need to question, is it truly accessible to all students? And wonder what are the hidden exclusion mechanisms that we may not be aware of and have become part of what we can consider the hidden curriculum. And how do we address the hidden aspects of the curriculum and of our institution, our infrastructure, our practices, our whole culture? How can we unpack that? In terms of connecting themes, there's been a lot of interesting discourse about decolonization of the curriculum. But to what extent can we use internationalization of the curriculum also as a tool for decolonization? We may have similar processes with slightly different outcomes or rationales or drivers, But surely when we join forces and work together, then we can probably move towards a more informed practice. Also, how can internationalization at home and internationalization abroad work together? We now see this enormous attention for COIL and virtual exchange. And this was very much caused by the fact that student mobility came to abrupt halt during the COVID pandemic. But they've never been mutually exclusive. Internationalization at home has always said that we should be aiming at the 100% of students, but obviously study abroad can be added to that. So how can they work in sync? How can they complement one another? And how can the digital transformation of higher education lead to new approaches in internationalization, moving beyond COIL and virtual exchange practices? So what is there to explore in the future? And to end, what would be a more holistic approach of internationalization, one that includes student well-being, support, and meaningful mutual engagement with communities? So plenty of food for thought. And in sum, if we want to move to more a robust and embedded and impactful practice, then what we need is to move towards a coherent, inclusive, and purposeful internationalization at home ecosystem that taps into all of the aspects of education, of teaching and learning, but placing the internationalization of the home curriculum at the core. And this is probably to the end of my closing plenary. And thank you so much for your attention. And I hope that you still have enough energy, maybe to ask some questions or to pose some comments. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides and hand back to you, Anthony.
Thank you. Thanks so much for that. That was really very inspiring indeed. And we can see already a question or a comment within the chat from Josephine Falade about the link between her session on sustainability and how we measure sustainable internationalization. And Josephine is saying, how would you define sustainable internationalization? That's a big question.
That's indeed a big question. And I don't think we've actually had enough time to discuss that, because on the one hand, I see practitioners linking internationalization as a process towards reaching or trying to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, because the Sustainable Development Goals are global challenges that require collaboration across different countries, across different disciplines, and across different sectors. And in my framing of internationalization, it's very much about using multiple perspectives to come to a better practice. And so internationalization at home, or internationalization of the home curriculum, can, I think, indeed equip students towards contributing partially to the Sustainable Development Goals. Absolutely. On the other hand, sustainable internationalization can also be interpreted as a practice that is sustainable, that doesn't depend on a number of enthusiasts and champions. And we recognize all of this, that as soon as, one colleague who has initiated a great project or a great module leaves, it's the end of that particular practice. So sustainable also means, and coming back to making sure that it's part of the fabric of a curriculum, it's part of the ecosystem.
Fantastic, and lots of love for the connection between internationalization and decolonizing, which is something many of us are looking to connect and harness energy for within our institutions. That's great. And general resonance about the thought-provoking nature of what you've said and how it really has summed up the themes of the conference, many of which are embedded within our videos, and connects so very well with what Eva was saying at the beginning. Thank you so much for your participation, both Eveke and Eva. You've really made the conference today, and the way in which you've drawn on the themes from the wider audience has really been excellent. Keep in touch, we'll keep in touch, and we look forward to seeing those of you who can make it to London.